The first sign of trouble wasn't the screaming. It wasn't even the explosions that began tearing through the outer hull of Colony Station Meridian. It was the silence that preceded them 37 seconds of absolute communications blackout. That every seasoned spacer knew meant death was coming. Commander Vex Torment pressed his scaled palm against the tactical display, watching red dots multiply across the holographic projection like a digital plague. 43 hegemony dreadnoughts had dropped out of hyperspace at the system's edge, their angular black holes bristling with weapons that could crack planets. Behind them came the troop transports, hundreds of them, carrying enough soldiers to subjugate every human colony within 50 light years. They're not responding to hails, reported Lieutenant Cass Raynard, her fingers dancing across her console with practiced desperation. Standard surrender protocols, diplomatic channels, even emergency frequencies, nothing. Torment's jaw tightened. The hegemony had been expanding aggressively for the past decade, swallowing smaller species with methodical efficiency. Humanity had always been too scattered, too fractured to present a unified resistance. Individual colonies fell one by one, their populations enslaved or worse. Meridian was supposed to be different, too remote, to pour in resources to warrant attention. They'd been wrong. Broadcast on all human frequencies, Torment ordered. Full emergency protocol. Tell them we need everything with engines and guns, now. Raynard's expression flickered with something between hope and despair. Sir, the nearest naval assets are at Armstrong Base. That's 6 hours at best. Assuming they do it anyway. The station shuddered as the first wave of hegemony fighters began their strafing runs through the reinforced viewports. Torment could see the small craft darting between the colony's defensive platforms. Like angry insects, the platforms returned fire with desperate intensity, their particle beams lancing out in brilliant blue streams. 3 fighters disintegrated in brief nevae of superheated metal and flesh. It wasn't nearly enough. For every fighter destroyed, 5 more took its place. Defensive grid is at 60% and falling, called out Ensign Marcus Dahl from the weapons station. His voice cracked slightly. The boy was barely 20, fresh from the academy on New Geneva. Platform 7 just went dark. 8 and 9 are reporting critical damage. The tactical display updated, showing the inexorable advance of the hegemony fleet. Their dreadnoughts hung back like patient predators, letting the smaller craft soften up the defenses before moving in for the kill. Torment had seen the recordings from Kepler for 2B, from New Carthage, from a dozen other worlds that had fallen to this same methodical approach. First the fighters, then the bombers, then the troop transports. The survivors would be sorted into categories: useful slaves, breeding stock, or protein for the hegemony's bioprocessors. Sir, Raynard's voice was barely audible over the growing chaos. I'm receiving scattered transmissions from the outer colonies. Sounds like this isn't an isolated attack. They're hitting everything within 30 light years simultaneously. The magnitude of it struck Torment like a physical blow. This wasn't a raid, it was the opening move of a complete extermination campaign. The hegemony had finally decided that humanity was too unpredictable, too volatile to be allowed to exist. Another shudder ran through the station as something massive impacted the central hub. Emergency lighting bathed the command center in hellish red as the primary power grid fluctuated. Through the viewports, Torment could see debris spinning away into space pieces of what had been Platform 3 and the 90 souls stationed aboard her. Time to boarding actions, he asked, though he already knew the answer would be measured in minutes, not hours. 12 minutes until the first troop transports reached docking range, Dahl reported. Maybe 15 if we can. His words were cut off as every console in the command center erupted in warnings. The tactical display flickered, zoomed out, and suddenly showed something impossible. At the very edge of sensor range, space itself seemed to be rippling. What the hell is that? Raynard whispered. Before anyone could answer, the ripples resolved into ships, dozens of them, then hundreds, dropping out of hyperspace with the coordinated precision of a military fleet. But these weren't any ships in the colonial databases. They were sleek, predatory things that seemed to drink in the light of Meridian star rather than reflect it. Their hulls were the deep black of space itself, broken only by geometric patterns that pulsed with an inner fire. Unknown fleet. This is Colony Station Meridian, Torment broadcast, his voice steady despite the ice forming in his veins. Identify yourselves. The response came not as words, but as data mass of information packet that overwhelmed the communications ray. and sent cascading code across every screen in the command center. When the static cleared, a single message remained, written in text that seemed to burn itself into their retinas. Terra remembers. Terra endures. Terra comes, and then the Ghost Fleet opened fire. The space between the Ghost Fleet and the hegemony Armada became a constellation of violence. The newcomers moved like nothing Tormund had ever seen, not even in the war archives. From humanity's bloodiest conflicts, their ships flowed through space in perfect synchronization, a dark river of death that carved through the hegemony formation with surgical precision. Each vessel was a masterwork of destructive engineering, bristling with weapons that defied classification. The first salvo from the Ghost Fleet wasn't energy beams or kinetic projectiles. It was something far worse. Dozens of hegemony fighters simply ceased. One moment they were diving toward Meridian's defensive platforms. The next they were expanding clouds of constituent atoms, their molecular bonds severed by weapons that operated on principles physics had yet to name. Jesus Christ, dull-breathed, his hands frozen over his console. What are those things firing? The hegemony fleet, to their credit, adapted quickly. Their dreadnoughts will deface this new threat, bringing massive plasma cannons to bear. The space between the fleets erupted in streams of superheated matter that could melt through a kilometer of solid titanium. The ghost ships didn't dodge. They didn't need to. Tormund watched in fascination and horror as the plasma streams simply bent around the dark vessels. Deflected by energy fields that twisted space-time itself, a few beams made contact, striking holes that should have vaporized instantly. Instead, the energy was absorbed, channeled into those geometric patterns that pulsed brighter with each impact. They're feeding on it, Reynard whispered. They're using the hegemony's own weapons to power their systems. One of the ghost ships, a sleek predator twice the size of a hegemony dreadnought, peeled away from the main formation. It accelerated toward the nearest cluster of enemy vessels with impossible grace, its hull rippling like liquid shadow. As it closed distance, sections of its superstructure began to unfold, revealing weapon systems that belonged in nightmares rather than spacecraft. The first weapon to fire looked like a twisted helix of dark energy. It struck the lead hegemony dreadnought amidships, and for a moment nothing seemed to happen. Then the massive warship began to fold in on itself, its hull plates bending and warping as if reality was becoming fluid around it. The screams of its crew echoed across open communication channels for exactly 17 seconds. Before being cut off by the sound of imploding metal, the second hegemony ship tried to retreat, its engines flaring to maximum burn. The ghost ship followed with leisurely precision, like a predator playing with wounded prey. This time, its weapon was different, a beam of absolute nothingness that left a perfectly circular hole through the dreadnought's core. Atmosphere vented in crystalline clouds as the massive ship broke apart along structural lines that hadn't existed moments before, but the hegemony weren't defenseless. Their fleet commanders began coordinating mass fire solutions, concentrating the output of dozens of vessels on single ghost ships. The space around the dark fleet became a maelstrom of energy discharges, particle beams, and kinetic projectiles moving at significant fractions of light speed. The first ghost ship to take serious damage was a smaller vessel, perhaps a frigate-class analog, caught in a crossfire between 3 dreadnoughts and a dozen heavy cruisers. Its protective fields finally overloaded. Plasma beams carved through its hull like surgical instruments, venting atmosphere and what looked like liquid fire into the vacuum. The ship's death was as alien as its weapons. Instead of exploding or breaking apart, it simply faded its substance, becoming less real with each passing second, until nothing remained but empty space and the memory of violence. They can die, Tormund said, more to himself than his crew. It was somehow both reassuring and terrifying. The Ghost Fleet's response was immediate and devastating. The remaining ships abandoned their individual hunting patterns and moved into a formation that hurt to look at, geometric shapes that folded through dimensions human mathematics couldn't properly describe. When they fired as one, the result wasn't simply an attack. It was an execution. Reality fractured along the line that bisected the hegemony fleet. Ships on one side of the fracture remained intact, while those on the other were translated into something that had never been built by rational minds. Hulls became flowing surfaces that pulsed with bioluminescent veins. Weapons batteries transformed into grasping appendages that reached out blindly. Before withering away, crew members, Tormund forced himself to look away from the sensor readings, showing what had happened to the crew members. 17 hegemony dreadnoughts died in that single attack. along with their escorts and support vessels. The remainder of the fleet began a panicked retreat, their formation dissolving into chaos as individual captains chose survival over honor. But the ghost ships weren't finished. They pursued the fleeing hegemony vessels with methodical patience, picking off stragglers with weapons that seemed to violate different physical laws with each shot. Some ships were simply erased from existence. Others were transformed into geometric impossibilities that folded in on themselves, until they occupied no space at all. A few lucky ones merely exploded in conventional nuclear fire. Mercy compared to the alternatives. Colony Station Meridian, a voice suddenly filled the command center, speaking in perfectly accented standard English despite originating from ships that predated human spaceflight by what felt like geological epochs. This is Admiral Cassandra Voss of the Terran Remnant Fleet. You are under our protection now. Maintain position and prepare for debriefing. Tormund stared at the tactical display, where the last of the hegemony fleet was being systematically annihilated by weapons that had no names in any human language. The ghost ships moved through the debris field like sharks through a feeding frenzy, ensuring nothing escaped to carry word of what had happened here. Admiral Voss, he managed, his voice hoarse with shock and something that might have been hope. This is Commander Tormund. We thank you for your intervention, but I have to ask, who are you? Where did you come from? The response carried undertones of steel and starfire, of losses counted in billions and vengeance measured in light years. We are what became of Earth after the hegemony burned our homeworld. Commander, we are the ones who chose to become monsters, so that humanity might survive their genocide. In the distance, the last hegemony dreadnought flickered out of existence, leaving nothing but rapidly cooling plasma and the echo of alien screams. And now, Admiral Voss continued, we have work to finish. The Ghost Fleet didn't stop at Meridian. Within hours of the battle's end, Tormund found himself aboard the flagship of humanity's most terrible secretive vessel that called itself the Nemesis Protocol. Its corridors were architectural impossibilities, stretching longer than the ship's external dimensions should have allowed. The walls pulsed with the same geometric patterns that covered the hull, and the air itself seemed to whisper with voices speaking languages that had never evolved on any world. Admiral Cassandra Voss was not what he'd expected. She appeared human tall, severe, with silver hair pulled back in a regulation military bun and eyes the color of deep space. But there were wrongnesses about her that became apparent only when looked at directly. Her shadow fell in directions that didn't correspond to any light source. Her reflection in the polished surfaces showed someone younger, angrier, with scars that told stories of impossible wars. You're wondering what we are, she said, gesturing for Tormund to take a seat across from her in what served as a briefing room. The walls displayed tactical information from across human space, dozens of red indicators showing hegemony fleets in the process of systematic extermination. The answer is complicated. Try me, Tormund said, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. Voss touched the control, and the room center filled with a holographic projection of Earth. Not Earth as it had been, but Earth as it was now, a blackened sphere wrapped in the geometric scars of weapons that had been designed to kill planets. The continents were gone, replaced by flowing patterns that hurt to look at directly. 4 to 7 years ago, the hegemony decided to solve the human problem once and for all, Voss explained, her voice carrying the weight of extinction. They came to Earth with a fleet of 10,000 ships and weapons specifically designed to ensure nothing could survive. Not the planet, not the biosphere, not even the bacteria in the deepest ocean trenches. The projection zoomed in, showing cities that had been transformed rather than destroyed. Buildings flowed like liquid while maintaining their structural integrity. Parks had become geometric gardens where impossible plants grew in patterns that followed mathematical principles rather than biology. But Earth didn't die, Tormund said, understanding beginning to dawn. No, it evolved. Voss's smile was sharp enough to cut space-time. The planet's defense grid included some experimental technologies, prototype weapons that were never supposed to be used, because their effects were considered unpredictable. When conventional defenses failed, the automated systems activated everything, including projects that violated several fundamental laws of physics. She gestured, and the display shifted to show massive installations buried beneath Earth's transformed surface. They were clearly artificial, but their geometry was wrong in ways that made Tormund's eyes water. Angles that shouldn't exist connected to surfaces that folded through dimensions humanity had no names for. The result was that Earth didn't just survive the attack, it absorbed it. Every weapon the hegemony fired, every ship they sent to the surface, every drop of alien blood spilled on human soil became part of something new, something that remembered what had been done to it. And the people, Tormund asked. Though he suspected he already knew the answer, the survivors were given a choice. Voss said simply, remain human and die with their species, or become something capable of ensuring the species' survival. The tactical display updated, showing new contacts appearing throughout human space. More ghost fleets were dropping out of hyperspace at the sites of active hegemony attacks. Each fleet moved with the same terrifying efficiency, turning routine raids into slaughterhouses. We've been preparing for this day for decades. Voss continued, building ships that could fight the hegemony on equal terms, training crews who could use weapons that conventional physics says shouldn't exist, waiting for them to make the mistake of trying to finish what they started. A new signal interrupted their conversation, a priority transmission from one of the other ghost fleets. The face that appeared on the screen was recognizably human, but like Voss, there were subtle wrongnesses. This man's eyes reflected light that wasn't there, and when he spoke, his words carried harmonics that suggested multiple vocal cords. Admiral, this is Captain Hendricks of the Retribution Engine. We've encountered heavy resistance at the Tau Ceti colony. The hegemony has deployed their Apex-class planet killers. Voss's expression hardened. How many? 12 vessels, supported by a full battle group. They're using the colony as bait, trying to draw us into a conventional engagement where their numbers advantage becomes decisive. Through the connection, Tormund could hear the sounds of battle, the distinctive whine of weapons that operated by rewriting local physics, the screams of metal and flesh being transformed into states that had no names. The Tau Ceti colony housed nearly 2 million humans across 17 orbital habitats and 3 terraformed worlds. They're learning, Voss said, more to herself than to Hendricks, adapting their tactics to counter our advantages. What are your orders, Admiral? Voss was quiet for a long moment, her inhuman eyes studying tactical projections that showed the scope of the hegemony's offensive. Hundreds of human worlds were under attack simultaneously. The ghost fleets were powerful, but they were also spread thin, trying to respond to every crisis at once. Signal all fleet commanders, she finally said. We're abandoning the defensive strategy. Full activation of Protocol 7. Hendricks's expression shifted to something that might have been shocked. Admiral, Protocol 7 hasn't been tested at this scale. The cascade effects could what, Captain? Destroy more human worlds than the hegemony already has? Voss's voice carried the chill of deep space. We didn't become monsters to fight a defensive war. We became monsters to end wars. She cut the connection and turned back to Tormund. Commander, I need to ask something of you. Your colony's communication array is more powerful than most, a result of being positioned at a major hyperspace junction. We need to broadcast a message to every human settlement within 100 light years. What kind of message? A warning in approximately 6 hours. We're going to demonstrate why the hegemony should have finished the job when they had the chance. Voss stood, and for a moment her human facade slipped entirely. Tormund found himself looking at something that had been forged in the death of worlds, tempered by genocidal rage, and sharpened on the bones of species that had tried and failed to destroy humanity. But Admiral, Tormund said, forcing himself to maintain eye contact with something that wore a human face, but had left humanity behind decades ago. What about the colonies that can't be evacuated in time? What about the millions of people still in hegemony territory? Voss paused at the door, her reflection showing the ghost of the woman she had once been. Commander, there's something you need to understand about Protocol 7. When we activate it, there won't be any hegemony territory left. The door sealed behind her with a sound like reality tearing, leaving Tormund alone with the tactical displays showing humanity scattered, worlds, and the knowledge that in 6 hours, the definition of the word monster was about to be rewritten by the species that had invented it. Protocol 7 began with silence across 17 star systems. The ghost fleet suddenly ceased their individual engagements and began moving toward predetermined coordinates. The hegemony forces, interpreting this as either retreat or regrouping, pressed their attacks with renewed vigor. It was exactly what Admiral Voss had counted on. Tormund watched from the Nemesis Protocol's command center as tactical displays showed the scope of the operation. Every ghost ship in human space was part of a vast geometric pattern that stretched across dozens of light years. When viewed from the proper dimensional perspective, something that required looking at the displays through sensors that violated several laws of optics. The formation resembled a three-dimensional model, with Earth's transformed bulk at its center. Initiating quantum entanglement locks, reported the ship's tactical officer, a woman whose name was apparently Meridian, though Tormund suspected that was her function. Rather than her identity, her fingers moved across controls that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions, touching interfaces that folded space around themselves. All fleets report ready status, came another voice, this one belonging to someone Tormund couldn't see. The Nemesis Protocol's crew included beings that had transcended physical form entirely, existing as patterns of conscious energy within the ship's reality warping systems. Admiral, Tormund said, his voice tight with apprehension, what exactly is Protocol 7 going to do? Voss stood before a command console that was less machine than living artwork, its surfaces flowing like liquid mercury while displaying information in languages that had never been spoken by biological vocal cords. It's going to give the hegemony exactly what they tried to give us, Commander, complete extinction. The first phase activated with the sound of reality breaking. Every ghost ship in the network fired simultaneously, but not at enemy targets. Instead, they fired at seemingly empty points in space, their weapons creating tears in the fabric of space-time itself. The tears began small pinpricks of absolute nothingness that would have been invisible if not for the way they bent light around themselves. Then they began to grow at the Kepler 438 system, where a hegemony battle group was in the process of sterilizing 3 human colonies. The first tier opened directly in the path of the enemy flagship. The massive dreadnought, a vessel the size of a small city, collided with the spatial anomaly. At 1/10 light speed. The result wasn't an explosion, it was an unmaking. The dreadnought's forward section simply ceased to exist as it passed through the tier, not destroyed, not vaporized, ceased. The atoms that had comprised its hull, its weapons, its crew were edited out of reality as if they had never been. The rest of the ship, unable to comprehend what had happened to its missing mass, began to collapse in on itself as fundamental forces tried to balance equations that no longer added up. First cascade initiated, Meridian reported, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested she was monitoring the event through senses that existed outside normal space-time. Quantum resonance is building as predicted. The tiers were growing larger, fed by the matter they consumed. At Kepler 438, the spatial anomaly had expanded to nearly a kilometer in diameter, and it was beginning to affect the local star. Solar plasma streamed into the void in brilliant ribbons, disappearing into nothingness that hungered for more. But the hegemony forces weren't passive victims. Their fleet commanders began coordinating desperate counterattacks, concentrating their fire on the ghost ships responsible for maintaining the tiers. At the Wolf 359 system, 12 hegemony dreadnoughts focused their main batteries on a single ghost vessel, the Vindication. Absolute. The ship's protective fields held for 17 seconds under the concentrated bombardment. Then, they failed. Plasma beams designed to crack planetary surfaces carved through the Vindication Absolute's hull. Like surgical instruments, the ship's exotic matter containment systems ruptured, releasing energies that had been harvested from the death of Earth itself. The resulting explosion was visible from neighboring star systems, a brief new star that burned with the fury of a species that refused to die quietly. But the tier the Vindication Absolute had been maintaining didn't collapse with the ship's destruction. Instead, it began to grow exponentially, fed by the exotic energies released in the ghost ship's death. Cascade failure at Wolf 359. Someone reported, the anomaly is destabilizing local spacetime. Tormund watched in fascination and horror as the tactical display showed the tier expanding to engulf the system's inner planets. Worlds that had been home to billions of hegemony citizens simply vanished as they crossed the event horizon of absolute nothingness. Their mass, their history, their very existence was consumed by a hunger that grew with each meal. Admiral, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, you're destroying entire star systems. Yes, Voss replied without turning from her console. 17 systems, to be precise. Every major hegemony population center within 50 light-years of human space. The scope of it was staggering. Trillions of lives were being erased from existence as the tiers continued to expand. The hegemony's response was increasingly frantic, fleets abandoning their attacks on human colonies to race toward the expanding anomalies, desperate to find some way to contain them. They were delayed by several billion years. At the Vega system, home to the hegemony's primary military academies. The tier had grown large enough to begin affecting the star itself. Stellar matter poured into the void in streams that could be seen from interstellar distances. The star, losing mass faster than fusion could replace it, began to collapse. The resulting gravitational distortions created secondary tiers that spread like infection through local space. Quantum resonance cascade is now self-sustaining. Meridian reported multiple systems showing spontaneous tier formation. How many? Voss asked. Current count is 47 primary anomalies with over 200 secondary formations. Rate of expansion is increasing exponentially. Tormund felt something cold settle in his stomach. Admiral, at this rate, won't the tiers eventually consume everything? Voss finished. Perhaps. That's the risk we accepted when we chose to become what we are. A new signal interrupted their conversation, an emergency transmission from the hegemony's high command. The face that appeared on the screen belonged to something that had once been recognizably organic, but millennia of genetic manipulation had transformed it into something both beautiful and terrible. Multiple eyes arranged in geometric patterns regarded them with intelligence that burned with the fury of a dying empire. To the human terror fleet, the being spoke in a voice that harmonized with itself across multiple octaves. We offer unconditional surrender. Cease your attacks and we will withdraw from all human territories. Your species will be granted full autonomy within your current borders. Voss studied the hegemony commander for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 47 years of preparation and the fury of a species that had been marked for extinction. Your offer is noted, High Commander. However, our response was decided the day you tried to murder our children in their schools and our elders in their beds. She gestured, and the tiers throughout hegemony space began expanding faster. There will be no negotiation, no terms, no mercy. You wanted to teach the galaxy what happens to species that refuse to submit to your will. Consider this lesson received. The transmission cut off, leaving only the sound of reality being systematically devoured by weapons that should never have been conceived by rational minds. In the tactical display, another star winked out of existence, taking its 17 worlds and 30 billion inhabitants with it into the void that hungered for more. The hegemony's final gambit came 12 hours later, when their remaining fleets converged on the Sol system in a desperate attempt to destroy the source of the quantum tiers. Admiral Voss had been expecting this. Earth's transformed surface pulsed with anticipation, its geometric scars glowing brighter as automated defense systems that had been dormant since the planet's death began awakening. The ghost fleets that had been scattered across human space started converging on humanity's birthworld, their ships moving through hyperspace along trajectories that followed mathematical principles rather than conventional physics. Enemy fleet composition? Voss asked, though she was already reviewing the tactical data streaming across her consciousness through direct neural interface. 3,740 decapital ships. Meridian reported, her voice carrying harmonics of excitement that no human throat could produce. Approximately 15,000 escort vessels. They've stripped defenses from their core worlds to mass this fleet. Tormund studied the tactical display with growing dread. The hegemony armada approaching Sol was larger than any military formation in recorded galactic history, even with their reality-warping weapons. The ghost fleets were outnumbered nearly 10 to 1. They're bringing everything, he said. If we lose here, we won't, Voss interrupted, but Tormund noticed her reflection showing signs of strain. Whatever humanity had become, they weren't invincible. Signal all fleet commanders. Battle formation Omega. Full activation of the Earth defense grid. The space around Sol began to change as the ghost fleets took their positions. Ships that had been built from the transformed matter of Earth itself arranged themselves in patterns that existed in more than 3 dimensions. When viewed from the proper perspective, they formed a vast geometric modula with Earth at its center, a design that served both tactical and metaphysical purposes. The hegemony fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the system's edge. Their vessels, arranged in the traditional battle formations that had conquered 1,000 worlds. But as they began their advance toward Earth, space itself began to resist them. The first casualties weren't from weapons fire. They were from the modified space-time around Sol that Earth's defense grid had been weaving for 47 years. Hegemony ships found their navigation systems reporting impossible readings distances that changed without movement, directions that led back to their starting points, velocities that increased while engines were shut down. Local space-time has been weaponized, reported the captain of the Hegemony flagship, his voice carrying across intercepted communications. Gravity wells are shifting without apparent cause. Recommend immediate. His transmission cut off as his ship collided with another vessel that sensors insisted was still 3,000 kilometers away. The collision tore both ships apart, their debris spreading in patterns that followed geometric principles rather than ballistic physics. That was the signal for the real battle to begin. The ghost ship Eternal Retribution fired first, its primary weapon creating a line of absolute void that bisected 17 Hegemony dreadnoughts. The targeted ships didn't explode, they simply ceased to exist along the weapon's path, their remaining sections tumbling away as their structural integrity failed. The Hegemony response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of weapons fired simultaneously, filling the space around the ghost ships with energies that could sterilize planets. Plasma streams, particle beams, and kinetic projectiles moving at significant fractions of light speed converged on their targets. The ghost ship Vengeance Incarnate took the brunt of the initial barrage. Its protective fields held for nearly 30 seconds under the concentrated fire. Before beginning to fail, plasma beams carved through its hull, releasing exotic matter that had been harvested from Earth's transformation. The ship's death was spectacular, a brief star that burned with colors that had no names in any language. But even as it died, the Vengeance Incarnate fired its final shot. The weapon, a concentrated beam of pure negation, struck the center of the Hegemony formation and began expanding outward in a sphere of nothingness. 23 enemy ships vanished as the negation field consumed them, their mass and energy adding to the field's power. First line taking heavy casualties, Meridian reported, her voice now carrying harmonics of pain as she felt each ghost ship's death. Through quantum entanglement, 14 vessels destroyed, 7 more severely damaged. The battle became a nightmare of physics violations and impossible geometries. Hegemony ships found themselves firing at targets that existed in multiple locations simultaneously, their weapons effects being redirected through folded space to strike their own allies. Ghost ships phased in and out of local reality, attacking from directions that didn't exist before vanishing into dimensions that had no names. The Righteous Fury, one of the largest ghost ships, materialized directly inside a Hegemony super dreadnought. The two vessels occupied the same space for exactly 0.7 seconds. Before the resulting paradox tore both ships apart, the explosion created a temporary black hole that consumed another dozen vessels before collapsing into a shower of exotic particles that existed for negative time. But the Hegemony weren't helpless. Their fleet commanders began adapting to the impossible conditions, using their numerical superiority to create overlapping fields of fire that even reality warping couldn't completely redirect. Ghost ships began dying faster, their exotic matter bleeding into space as conventional weapons found gaps in their defenses. The implacable will died when 17 plasma beams struck it simultaneously from different angles. Its hull, forged from matter that had been transformed in Earth's death, held for nearly a minute before fracturing along quantum fault lines. The ship's crew beings that had sacrificed their humanity for the power to fight impossible wars were released back into the transformed Earth's embrace, their consciousness absorbed into the planetary defense grid. We're losing too many ships, Tormund said, watching the tactical display show the Ghost Fleet's formation beginning to collapse. At this rate, we complete the mission, Voss replied. Her human facade was slipping, revealing glimpses of what she had become. Signal Earth Defense Grid, initiate final protocol. Deep beneath Earth's transformed surface, weapons that had been charging for 4 to 7 years finally reached full power. The planet's geometric scars began glowing with the fury of a dying star, as energies that existed outside conventional physics were channeled into systems that violated several fundamental laws of reality. The first shot from Earth itself was a beam of crystallized time, fired at the heart of the Hegemony formation. The beam moved through space at impossible speeds, arriving at its target before it had finished firing. The 16 Hegemony dreadnoughts it struck aged 10 billion years in 0.3 seconds, their crews dying of entropy while their hulls crumbled to cosmic dust. The second shot was gravity itself, weaponized and directed. A section of the Hegemony fleet suddenly found itself experiencing the gravitational pull of a neutron star, their ships crushed to atomic soup while their crews were compressed into exotic matter. But Earth's most terrible weapon was its third shot, a beam of pure negation that didn't just destroy its targets, but edited them out of history itself. The 47 hegemony ships it struck had never existed. Their crews had never been born. Their worlds had never evolved the life that gave birth to their species. The effect rippled backward through time, creating paradoxes that the universe itself had to resolve. Stars that had been born to provide light for non-existent worlds flickered out of existence. Trade routes that had been established to serve markets that had never existed collapsed into temporal static. Causality cascade initiated, Meridian reported, her voice now carrying harmonics of something approaching terror. Reality revision is propagating through local space-time. The surviving hegemony ships found themselves fighting an enemy that was editing their existence out of the universe itself. Ships that had existed moments before were discovered to have never been built. Crew members forgot why they were fighting as the reasons for the war were systematically removed from history. In desperation, the hegemony fleet began targeting Earth directly, hoping to destroy the source of the reality-warping attacks. Thousands of weapons fired at humanity's transformed homeworld. Their combined output sufficient to shatter continents. The planet absorbed every shot. Earth's transformed surface drank in the plasma beams and particle streams like a starving organism, consuming its first meal in eons. The geometric patterns covering the planet pulsed brighter with each impact, channeling the incoming energy into systems that had been waiting decades for this moment. They're feeding us, Voss said, her voice carrying notes of savage satisfaction. Every shot they fire makes us stronger. The hegemony fleet began to realize their mistake as Earth's weapons fired again with increased power. This time, the planet's response wasn't just destructive, it was creative. Ships struck by the reality-warping beams were transformed rather than destroyed, their hulls flowing like liquid metal while their crews were reorganized into patterns that served Earth's will. A hegemony supercarrier became a massive flower of living metal, its transformed crew singing songs of entropy while their ship body drifted through space, converting everything it touched into more of itself. A battle cruiser was turned inside out through 11 dimensions, existing as a climbed bottle of screaming steel that attacked its own fleet with weapons that fired backwards through time. Casualty reports from all fronts, Meridian announced, her voice now carrying harmonics of multiple deaths, as quantum entanglement allowed her to experience each loss directly. Ghost fleet casualties, 37 vessels destroyed, 23 critically damaged. Hegemony casualties, approximately 2,000 ships destroyed or transformed. Crew losses estimated at 4 to 7 million and climbing. The battle had become a massacre, but it was costing both sides everything they had. Each ghost ship that died took decades of preparation and irreplaceable knowledge with it. Each transformed hegemony vessel added to the chaos-consuming local space, creating hazards that threatened both fleets equally. Tormund watched a hegemony dreadnought phase partially out of reality, its crew screaming across all communication frequencies as they experienced existence in 17 dimensions simultaneously. The ship's weapons fired randomly, striking friend and foe alike with beams that turned matter into mathematical equations that solved themselves through violence. Admiral, he said, his voice tight with something beyond horror, we're not just winning this battle, we're breaking the universe. Voss turned to look at him, and for a moment her human mask slipped completely. What looked back at him was something that had been forged in the death of worlds, tempered by genocidal fury and sharpened on the screams of dying civilizations. Commander, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke of the price of survival. That was always the point. The turning point came when the hegemony deployed their ultimate weapon, a device they called the reality anchor. It was a massive construct, larger than most space stations, that had been built using technologies salvaged from extinct civilizations. Its purpose was simple, to lock local spacetime into a fixed configuration, preventing the reality-warping effects that gave the Ghost Fleet their decisive advantage. The device activated as the surviving hegemony forces retreated to the edge of the Sol system, its influence spreading outward in a sphere of crystallized reality. Where the field touched them, the ghost ships found their exotic weapons failing, their dimensional advantages neutralized. Field effect confirmed, Meridian reported, her voice carrying new harmonics of pain as the reality anchor severed her quantum connections to other vessels. Exotic matter systems are destabilizing. Dimensional phase generators are offline. Admiral Voss studied the tactical display as the balance of the battle shifted dramatically. Without their reality-warping capabilities, the ghost ships were still formidable, But they were no longer godlike. The surviving hegemony forces, recognizing their opportunity, began pressing their attack with renewed fury. The inexorable Judgment was the first ghost ship to fall to conventional weapons since the Reality Anchor's activation. Caught in crossfire from 6 hegemony heavy cruisers, its hull no longer protected by impossible physics cracked under sustained plasma bombardment. The ship died like ships had died for millennia, in fire and screaming metal in the brief flash of atoms remembering fusion. But Admiral Voss was smiling. "Signal the defense grid," she ordered. "Initiate Protocol Omega, Admiral," Tormund said, recognizing something terminal in her tone. "What is Protocol Omega?" "The reason we spent 47 years preparing for this moment, Commander. The reason. We allowed ourselves to become monsters." Voss moved to the command console, her fingers dancing across controls that existed in more dimensions than human hands should have been able to reach. "We always knew they might find a way to neutralize our tactical advantages, so we prepared for the possibility that we might have to win this war the human way." Deep beneath Earth's transformed surface, systems that had been dormant since the planet's death began their final activation sequence. But these weren't the reality-warping weapons that had been terrorizing the hegemony fleet. These were older technologies, simpler ones, built on principles that even the Reality Anchor couldn't neutralize. They were nuclear weapons, hundreds of thousands of them. But these weren't the crude fusion devices that humanity had built during its primitive period. These were stellar engineering tools, weapons that used stars themselves as ammunition. 47 years of preparation had allowed Earth's transformed systems to hollow out the Sol System's asteroid belt, converting every piece of rock and ice into delivery vehicles for warheads that could crack planets. Launching solar torpedoes, Meridian announced, her voice carrying new harmonics of anticipation. Target, Hegemony Reality Anchor. The first wave consisted of 12 projectiles, each one containing a miniaturized star held in perfect stasis. They accelerated toward their target at 90% of light speed, their passage through space creating visible distortions as their mass warped local gravity. The hegemony point defense systems opened fire immediately, recognizing the threat. Plasma beams and particle streams lanced out to intercept the incoming torpedoes. But the weapons were designed to survive passage through stellar coronas. Conventional energy weapons barely scorched their surfaces, the first torpedo to reach. The Reality Anchor detonated exactly 1.7 kilometers from its target. The miniaturized star within the warhead was released from stasis and immediately resumed the fusion processes that had been frozen at the moment of its creation. For 0.003 seconds, a piece of stellar core burned in the vacuum of space with the fury of a main sequence star. The Reality Anchor's defensive fields held against the stellar detonation, but the device itself was pushed 300 kilometers off station by the shockwave. More importantly, the exotic matter composing its reality stabilization systems began to show stress fractures, as forces that could forge planets hammered against its protective barriers. The second torpedo struck while the anchor was still recovering from the first. This time, the stellar detonation occurred only 800 meters from the device's core. The Reality Anchor's fields collapsed entirely, and the device itself, a construct that had taken the combined resources of 17 worlds to build, was vaporized in the nuclear fire of an artificial sun. With the Reality Anchor destroyed, the Ghost Fleet's exotic capabilities returned in a rush of impossible physics and weaponized mathematics. But Admiral Voss wasn't finished with conventional warfare. Second wave launching, Meridian reported. Target, surviving hegemony fleet. This time, it wasn't dozens of stellar torpedoes. It was thousands. Every major asteroid in the Sol System had been converted into a delivery vehicle, and now they were all launching simultaneously. The space around Earth became a constellation of artificial stars, as miniaturized suns were hurled toward the enemy fleet at velocities that made interception nearly impossible. The hegemony forces tried to run, but they had already committed too deeply to the attack. Their ships were caught in the inner system when the stellar bombardment began, trapped between Earth's defensive grid and an expanding shell of nuclear fire that moved at relativistic speeds. The heavy cruiser Domination Eternal was caught by 3 stellar torpedoes simultaneously. The ship vanished in a brief nova that outshone Sol itself, its crew experiencing temperatures that existed only in the cores of dying stars. The destroyer squadron that had been escorting it was caught in the expanding shockwave, their hulls sublimating into plasma before they had time to register what was happening. Enemy fleet is breaking apart, Tormund reported, watching the tactical display show hegemony formations dissolving into chaos. As stellar torpedoes found their targets, they're trying to retreat. But there's nowhere to run, Voss finished. We've had 4 to 7 years to prepare this killing field, Commander. Every escape route has been anticipated. The final phase of the battle was less a military engagement than a systematic execution. The surviving hegemony ships found themselves trapped in a maze of artificial gravity wells and spatial distortions, herded like prey toward predetermined killing zones where stellar torpedoes waited in patient orbits. The super dreadnought Final Hegemony, flagship of the enemy fleet, made a desperate attempt to ram Earth directly. Its captain had apparently decided that mutual destruction was preferable to the slow annihilation his fleet was experiencing. The massive ship accelerated toward humanity's homeworld, its engines burning at maximum power. Earth's response was personal. A single beam of crystallized time reached out from the planet's surface, striking the Final Hegemony at the moment it entered the inner system. The ship aged 1 billion years in the span of a heartbeat, its crew dying of entropy while their vessel crumbled to cosmic dust. But the beam didn't stop there. It followed the ship's trajectory backward through time, aging every component that had ever been part of the vessel. The metals that had formed the ship's hull aged back to the stellar furnaces, where they had been forged. The worlds where those metals had been mined experienced sudden geological instability, as elements that should have existed were edited out of their planetary cores. The stars that had provided energy for the ship's construction flickered as their fusion processes were disrupted by temporal paradox. Temporal cascade is propagating beyond local space, Meridian reported, her voice carrying harmonics of something approaching awe. We're editing their entire supply chain out of history. Tormund stared at the tactical display, watching as the last hegemony ships died in fires that burned hotter than stars around them. Space itself was healing from the wounds inflicted by weapons that should never have existed, reality reasserting itself in patterns that followed laws physics hadn't discovered yet. Admiral, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, what have we become? Voss looked at him with eyes that had seen the death of worlds and the birth of monsters, her human mass finally falling away completely to reveal something that had been forged in genocide and tempered by necessity. We become exactly what they forced us to become, Commander. We become the thing that ensures our children never have to. In the tactical display, the last hegemony ship winked out of existence, leaving only cooling plasma and the echo of their final transmission of surrender. That had come 47 years too late, 6 months after the Battle of Seoul. Commander, Vex Tormund stood on the observation deck of Colony Station Meridian, watching construction ships rebuild what the hegemony had destroyed. The work proceeded with inhuman efficiency. Vessels that had once been ghost ships now serve peaceful purposes. Their reality warping capabilities turned toward creation rather than destruction. The war was over. The hegemony had surrendered unconditionally after their remaining fleets discovered that their homeworlds no longer existed, not destroyed, but edited out of history itself by weapons that operated through temporal mechanics no sane species should have mastered. 3/4 of their territory had been consumed by the quantum tears that continued to spread across their former empire, creating vast regions of space where the laws of physics were more suggestions than absolute rules. But victory had come at a cost that humanity was still calculating. The final tally is in, Admiral Voss said, materializing beside him with the unsettling way she had of moving through space. That didn't entirely exist. Her human appearance was more stable now, though. Her reflection still showed someone who had paid prices that couldn't be measured in conventional currency. 43 ghost ships lost, along with their crews. That's nearly 8,000 souls who gave up their humanity to save our species. Tormund nodded, studying the data tablet she handed him. The numbers were staggering in ways that went beyond simple mathematics. Each ghost ship crew member had undergone transformation processes that erased their individual existence, merging their consciousness with systems that operated on principles borrowed from dead civilizations. They had become living weapons, sacrificing everything that made them human for the power to fight impossible wars. And the hegemony casualties, he asked. Though he suspected the numbers would be beyond comprehension, conservative estimates put their losses at 9 to 7 trillion beings across 14,000 worlds, Voss replied, her voice carrying the weight of extinction. Most of them civilians who had no part in their government's decision to attempt genocide against humanity. The magnitude of it was overwhelming. In their desperate fight for survival, humanity had become responsible for the largest mass extinction event in galactic history. The ghost fleets had killed more sentient beings in 6 months than had died in all previous interstellar wars combined. Any regrets, Admiral? Tormund asked. Voss was quiet for a long moment, her inhuman eyes studying the reconstruction efforts outside. Human ships worked alongside vessels that had once belonged to species the hegemony had conquered, liberated worlds whose populations were finally free to determine their own futures. I regret that it was necessary, she finally said. I regret that we were forced to become monsters to save our children. I regret that the hegemony's leaders chose genocide over coexistence. Her voice hardened, carrying harmonics that spoke of decisions that could never be undone. But I don't regret our response. They came to our worlds with weapons designed to ensure nothing could survive. We gave them exactly what they brought to us. A new signal interrupted their conversation, a transmission from the outer system. The face that appeared on Tormund's communication device belonged to Captain Elena Vasquez, commander of the human colony's ship New Horizon. Behind her, Tormund could see families working together to establish settlements on worlds that had been freed from hegemony control. Commander, Admiral, Vasquez said, her voice carrying the exhaustion and hope of someone who had survived the impossible. I wanted to report that the Tau Ceti colonies are officially operational. We've got 3 million people settled across 17 worlds, and more ships arriving daily. The terraforming systems the hegemony abandoned are actually accelerating the process. We should have fully habitable environments within 5 years. Any problems with the locals? Voss asked. Several species that had been enslaved by the hegemony were now sharing worlds with human colonists, a situation that required careful diplomatic management. Nothing we can't handle, Vasquez replied. The Zephyrians are actually helping with the agricultural systems. Their plant symbiosis technology is incredibly advanced, and the Chronari have agreed to share their mining expertise in exchange for medical support. She paused, her expression growing more serious. There is one issue, though. We're getting reports of anomalies in some of the former hegemony sectors, regions where the quantum tears are still active. Tormund felt something cold settle in his stomach. The tears that had consumed hegemony space were supposed to have been temporary effects, collapsing once their target systems were destroyed. But some of them had apparently achieved self-sustaining status, continuing to grow and consume matter while spreading into previously unaffected regions. How extensive? Voss asked. 17 star systems so far, with the affected area expanding at roughly 1 light-year per month. The tears seemed to be following hyperspace routes, spreading along the paths of highest traffic density. Voss's expression didn't change, but Tormund noticed her reflection showing signs of concern that bordered on fear. The weapons humanity had used to defeat the hegemony were continuing to operate, consuming sections of the galaxy without regard for the intentions of their creators. We'll send investigation teams, she said finally. In the meantime, maintain safe distances from any affected systems and alert all colonies to avoid hyperspace routes that pass near the anomalies. The transmission ended, leaving Tormund and Voss alone with the implications of what they had unleashed. Outside the observation deck, human and alien ships continued their work of rebuilding civilization from the ashes of the largest war in galactic history. Admiral, Tormund said, what happens if we can't stop the tears? What happens if they keep spreading until they consume everything? Voss turned to look at him, and for a moment her human facade slipped to reveal glimpses of what she had become, something that existed partially outside normal space-time, connected to systems that operated by principles that violated several fundamental laws of physics. Then we'll have learned the same lesson every species learns eventually, Commander, that survival sometimes requires choices that transform you into something your children won't recognize. She gestured toward the reconstruction efforts outside, where human and alien workers labored together to build a future neither species could have imagined a year earlier. But perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing. A new transmission arrived, this one from Earth itself. The planet's transformed surface pulsed with geometries that hurt to look at directly, but the patterns were subtly different now, less aggressive, more contemplative. The voice that spoke with Admiral Voss's, but older, stranger, carrying harmonics that suggested it came from someone who existed in more than 3 dimensions. All Ghost Fleet commanders, the transmission said, report to Earth for final debriefing. It's time to discuss what comes next. Boss smiled, and for the first time since Tormund had met her, the expression seemed genuinely human. "What comes next, Admiral?" he asked. "What comes next, Commander? Is that we figure out how to be human again, or at least, how to be something our species can live with?" She moved toward the observation deck's exit, her form becoming less solid. As she prepared to transit through dimensions that had no names, the war is over. The real work is just beginning. As she vanished into the spaces between spaces, Tormund remained at the observation deck, watching human and alien ships work together to build something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. In the distance, Earth hung like a transformed jewel, its geometric scars glowing with the promise of possibilities that physics had yet to discover. Humanity had survived. They had won. And in doing so, they had become something that would ensure their children would never again face extinction. At the hands of those who mistook mercy for weakness, the Ghost Fleet's work was done. What came next would be written by the living, for the living. In the spaces between the stars where monsters and miracles were separated by nothing more than the choices that shaped them. Outside the observation deck, construction continued, building tomorrow from the ashes of yesterday, while the quantum tears that had consumed the hegemony continued their slow expansion into regions where new stories waited to be written in the language of survival, transformation, and the terrible mathematics of hope.